Now, without further ado, I'm also very pleased to be the moderator of our first session of this conference, which is titled Sensory Experiences. I'll keep the introductions of the speakers very short for the sake of timekeeping. First up, to kick off our conference, we have Julie Kim, Associate Professor of English at Fordham University, who will be speaking about John Tyley's experiments in illustration. So please, Julie.
Hi, everyone. I'm very excited to be here. So thank you to the APS and the Academy for organizing this conference. So I'll just get right into it in the interest of time. This is about John Tyley's experiments in illustration. One day in June 1800, colonial officials in St. Vincent raided the home of free person of color John Tyley, looking for evidence that he was involved in what they called a seditious plot to overthrow British rule on the Caribbean island. Officials suspected Tyley because other free people of color had sent him letters with complaints about their unequal status and treatment in St. Vincent, including statements, quote, grossly abusive of the white inhabitants of the West Indies, at least according to the white officials reading the letters. Whether there actually was a plot is questionable, however, since these same officials admitted that, quote, there does not appear to be any immediate plan fixed on for effecting a change, either by force or intrigue here. Officials also failed to find any evidence directly implicating Tyley, since Tyley found out about the impending search just in time to dispose of any potentially incriminating papers. As the officials regretfully reported, Tyley ripped his writings into shreds and threw them into a neighboring cane field, from which they were never retrieved. In many ways, this is a typical story of persecution in the late 18th century Caribbean. Colonial authorities throughout the region were fearful of uprisings, especially after the commencement of the Haitian Revolution. In St. Vincent, British officials were particularly worried since a coalition of indigenous African and French fighters had revolted against the government in 1795, and the after effects of that conflict, now known as the Second Carib War, were still being felt years later, including when Tyley came under suspicion. What was less typical was the fact that Tyley, before he became a suspected conspirator and enemy of the government, had actually been employed by it in St. Vincent. As the report on Tyley's seditious, or quote, seditious activities noted, Tyley was a botanical painter at the Royal Botanic Garden in St. Vincent. Furthermore, prior to the raid, the governor of St. Vincent himself had praised Tyley for showing, quote, great ability in delineating the different kinds of fruit and flowers produced in the Botanic Garden. Of Tyley's artistic talents and sensibility, the governor also stated that Tyley was, quote, the only man of that turn, I believe, in the West Indies. Indeed, Tyley is still an original today. He is one of the few artists of African descent that we know of from the colonial British Caribbean. And as far as I know, he's the only one to leave behind clearly identifiable works, which can be found today at the Hunt Institute for Botanical Documentation and the Linnean Society of London. So here are just a few works from the Hunt Institute, which has a collection of 51 works by Tyley. And then here are a few from the Linnean Society of London, which has a collection of it's 149 works, although we're not sure if every single one is by Tyley. Now on these, what's interesting is you can see Tyley's signature on each of them in the lower left-hand corner. Since we do have this archive for Tyley and one that is in his own hand, that is significant. There is an archive, even though his writings, the ones he threw into the cane field, are now gone. And given this archive, I want to spend the rest of my time here thinking about the question, if Tyley was writing about politics while also drawing botanical illustrations in the garden, was there any connection between the two activities? What was he thinking about and doing when he was creating paintings of plants? Typically, if botanical illustrations are thought of as having a politics, they're usually seen as supporting empire. After all, botanical illustrations in the 18th century were intended to be tools of imperial knowledge production. They enabled information about plants in colonial territories to be captured in the form of drawings and transported back to the metropole. Yet if botanical illustrations, and by extension illustrators, supported imperial ends in theory, there is increasing evidence that they did not always do so in practice. For instance, Yoda Batsaki, Sarah Burke-Cahalan, and Anatole Chikine have argued that botany was characterized by a, quote, plurality of philosophical and social agendas, including anti-colonial and revolutionary ones. Relatedly, Britt Russert has coined the term fugitive science to describe the ways in which 19th century African Americans engaged both in typical scientific experimentation and in, quote, experiments in mapping, movement, and escape, as well as experiments in freedom. Building on Russert, I will argue in what follows that Tyley's botanical illustrations are not only experiments in freedom, but also sensory experiences of it. The words experiment and experience are closely related. To experience is a now obsolete meaning of to experiment. I'm emphasizing experience because I'm interested in thinking about what kinds of freedom may have been available to Tyley, even as he lived in an environment that severely restricted his legal and political rights. And what I want to suggest is that botanical illustration as a process and practice versus a finished product may have offered Tyley meaningful experiences of escape, movement, and transformation via the act of drawing itself. As historian of science Ian Glenn has suggested, the creation of a botanical illustration, as much as any other form of art, could serve as, quote, an agent of memory, inward meaning, and otherness. Or to put it in slightly different terms, a catalyst of interiority. Multi-species anthropologist John Hartigan Jr. too has written vividly about the way that spending time observing and drawing plants changed his internal thought processes, which became populated with dreams of one particular plant, quote, growing in my mind, its lanky stems expanding, its opposite leaves unfolding as it gained in stature and expanded. As he also stated, quote, the life form became part of my thinking. Hartigan's testimony suggests that spending time with plants gives us as humans different ways of being and living in the world. Intriguingly, his views also correlate with work by contemporary Black writers who have increasingly recognized the ability of plants to give us experiences of pleasure that are in themselves liberating. Jamaica Kincaid, for example, has written of the importance of surrounding oneself with, quote, things planted for no other reason than the sheer joy of it. Hanif Abdurraqib, too, has written poems in which he has used dandelion seeds as figures for expressing the scattering or spreading of his, quote, whole mind across open fields and spaces. What if Tyley was finding similar alternative pathways to freedom as he drew? That Tyley found something worthwhile in St. Vincent is suggested by the fact that he spent 7 years working at the Royal Botanic Garden from 1793 to 1800. As a matter of fact, Tyley only left St. Vincent when he was forced by colonial officials to leave the island permanently after the search of his home. During the time he worked at the St. Vincent Royal Botanic Garden, Tyley was employed by Alexander Anderson, a naturalist who was serving as the garden's superintendent. Anderson hired Tyley because he wanted to publish an illustrated catalog of all the plants growing in the garden. The catalog was never published, but drafts still exist, and many of Tyley's surviving illustrations are part of these drafts. As these drafts indicate, Anderson largely dictated the content of the illustrations, which primarily depicted plants that Anderson considered scientifically valuable or important. Anderson was especially interested in nondescript species previously undescribed by naturalists, that he might get credit for finding. For instance, there is this illustration of a plant that Anderson called named Polycarpa scandens. Anderson focused in his catalog description on the fact that he had never seen this plant before in person or in other botanists' works. He also dwelled on the hardships that he felt he had undergone to acquire this plant, which he claims he found only because he had traversed, quote, wild, untrodden forests far remote from the comforts of home in the Guyanas. Yet if Anderson emphasized his travails and hardship, Tyley's illustration almost does the opposite. It presents a plant imbued with lightness, playfulness, and even joy. It is the flourish Tyley includes at the very tip of the plant that brings the image to life. With its twists and turns, this upward curving tendril refuses to be linear and simple. Instead, because it is connected to the central stem, it pulls the whole plant into a posture of vertical movement and persistent reaching. The central stem and plant wind upwards, almost as though towards something existing beyond the confines of the paper itself. The renowned tropical plant botanist Francis Tyley has written about the feeling of freedom that observing a plant can produce. Drawing on Nelson Mandela, who observed that being able to garden in prison allowed him temporary escapes from his situation, Tyley writes about how watching plants carefully and attuning oneself to their slower than human rhythms can liberate us from our typical ways of being and make, quote, time itself become visible. David George Haskell, another botanist, has similarly written about entering what he calls flower time and another reality when sitting for hours watching one plant bloom. Tyley, too, would have spent long hours observing the same plant. Botanical illustrators today have noted that they can spend days creating one illustration. In fact, we can see evidence of this time spent with plants in Tyley's illustrations themselves. For example, the verve in the illustration of Polycarpus scandens testifies to the likelihood that Tyley was observing a living plant versus a dead specimen, and most likely sitting with it for extended periods in the garden. We can also look at another illustration by Tyley for more evidence of the time he spent with plants. The finely detailed depiction of the clump of white flowers suggests that Tyley did anything but rush through his painting. The tiny white flowers may also indicate that Tyley was experiencing a kind of escape and joy when painting plants. As anyone who has tried their hand at botanical illustration knows, painting such minute elements in watercolor is an extremely difficult and sometimes maddening exercise. And I think you can see this just by thinking about the fact that painting in watercolor is basically the art of controlling the movement of water across paper. At the same time, psychologists have noted that artists and others involved in detail-oriented creative work often enter what they call a state of flow. Flow is what occurs when, quote, a person's body or mind is stretched to its limits in a voluntary effort to accomplish something difficult and worthwhile. And when it happens, quote, people are so involved in an activity that nothing else seems to matter. The experience itself is so enjoyable that people will do it even at great cost for the sheer sake of doing it. There's deep satisfaction, in other words, that comes from immersing oneself in an all-absorbing task. And perhaps that is what kept Tyley at the St. Vincent Royal Botanic Garden. I will conclude with one final example of Tyley's art that I think encapsulates the argument I've been making about Tyley finding a kind of experiential freedom while painting. This painting was unknown to scholars until 2021, when it went up for sale at an auction and was purchased by the Linnean Society of London. It depicts a breadfruit tree, which is not surprising given that St. Vincent was strongly associated with breadfruit in the late 18th century. In 1791, a British government-sponsored expedition brought breadfruit from Tahiti to the Caribbean, with the St. Vincent Royal Botanic Garden being the first drop-off point. What is surprising, however, is the human figure sitting underneath the breadfruit tree. I say surprising because this work clearly draws on the genre of the botanical illustration. The background of the composition is blank, and there is a Latin caption providing the breadfruit tree's Latin binomial. And I don't know if you can read it, but the caption is now slightly outdated. It says Artocarpus incisus, and the current scientific name of breadfruit is Artocarpus altilis. But still, that was the scientific name at the time. Yet botanical illustrations from this period did not contain human figures, and none of Tyley's other surviving works do. But Tyley certainly could have been experimenting with the form of the botanical illustration, which was not a static or uniform genre. More than that, the way he depicts the human figure suggests that he was exploring the idea of the garden as a place of refuge. The way the figure is positioned is especially evocative, as the person being depicted seems to be leaning back on one hand and resting. This is a pose of repose and perhaps even contemplation. We can compare it to the portrait of Phyllis Wheatley that appears as the frontispiece to her published book of poems. Both figures sit in profile, looking into the distance, seemingly lost in thought. While such a pose may seem far from unusual, to depict an enslaved person resting in the 18th century Caribbean was, I think, a potentially radical act. And we can guess that this person was enslaved because of the clothing that he is depicted wearing. Blue pantaloons were commonly shown in paintings of enslaved individuals from this period, and the lack of a shirt is also telling. For enslaved laborers, life on the plantation was a life of near constant work. Tyley's subject then is notable for his stillness and quiet occupation of the space under the breadfruit tree. We cannot read this painting as a straightforward depiction of reality, of course. There is no evidence at the moment to indicate whether Tyley was depicting an actual individual or a generic figure. We also don't know if Tyley truly observed this scene. Yet it is easy to imagine that such a scene could have taken place. Historian of slavery Stephanie M.H. Camp has written about the ways that enslaved laborers consistently took what opportunities they could find to resist the disciplining of their bodies on the plantation by refiguring them as, quote, sites of pleasure and resistance. Camp was writing about dance, but could Tyley's laborer have been finding a moment of his own to do what he wanted in the company of a breadfruit tree? Is it even possible that Tyley created this painting as a reflection or refraction of his own experiences interacting with and spending time with plants? Being free as Tyley was profoundly different from being enslaved. Yet Olaudah Equiano, for one, pointed out the immense constraints on the lives of free Africans in the Caribbean by acerbically declaring in his autobiographical narrative that they experienced only a, quote, mockery of freedom. Perhaps then it is not so far-fetched to imagine Tyley existing on a continuum with his subject. And perhaps we can see them both sitting in the garden, enjoying the company of plants and trees, and seeking out moments of pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julie. And next up, so we will carry on with the presentation. So please, those in the room, save your questions and thoughts about this fascinating first paper for the panel discussion. Next up, we have Jesse Curran, lecturer in English at State University, New York, Old Westbury, who will speak about Arthur Dove's Sand and Sea on abstract landscapes, place in natural history.
Good afternoon, everyone. So my paper's title, Arthur Dove's Sand and Sea on Abstract Landscapes, Place in Natural History. And I'm not going to talk too much about this image. I'm going to get going with something else. But my paper today will touch on art, natural history, and philosophy, though I stand in front of you first and foremost as a poet critic, a proud and humble member of a tradition of literary scholars who work to practice the subjects they theorize. My poetic inquiry concerns looking ever deeper into the experience of place. Place is interdisciplinary, phenomenological, and profoundly environmental, and can be thought of as a present manifestation of the ancient reach of natural history. Today, I will suggest that spending time beholding the landscape art of one's place can, in the words of philosopher Ed Casey, be both enriching and sustaining, quote, enabling us to become enduring denizens of the place world to which we so fatefully belong. I am immensely fortunate to have a landscape artist of my place. A native of the Finger Lakes, Arthur Dove spent the better part of 2 decades of his adult life on the North Shore of Long Island, living on a 42-foot sailboat and sometimes the adjacent yacht club in Huntington Harbor, and then later in his life in a tiny house on the Centerport Mill Pond. I was born in the hospital where he died, where you can see Huntington Harbor from the top floors and smell low tide when you step outside. Dove was devoted to landscape. He was also an experimental modernist and often is considered America's first artist to seriously explore abstraction. As his subjects were often drawn from my most immediate surroundings, Dove's work has offered me the poetic opportunity to practice a particular type of landscape ekphrasis. Ekphrasis is when a poet looks at a work of art and produces a poem. It's a very kind of ancient, common form of poetry. But the landscape ekphrasis I've been working with, I think of as almost like a chiasmic ekphrasis that doubles back on itself to enliven geographic and ecological being. One beholds the painting and then the place the painting represents, and returns to the world with deepened insight, attention, and appreciation, and in my case, gratitude. I call our place the space between 2 necks, a coast shaped by the recession of the Wisconsin Glacier. It's an area not too many miles east of the geography Fitzgerald famously mapped in The Great Gatsby, the 2 eggs, which he called 2 unusual formations of land. It's the same geography, but a little bit further east. Most of my life, I've dwelt in this space, experiencing both love and aversion, sometimes fleeing and at other moments anchoring down as if to weather its storms of development and destruction. While much of his biography is rich and relevant, it is important to recognize that Dove was a lifelong naturalist, a farmer, hunter, fisherman, and sailor. From early in life, he engaged with the natural world through both observation and interaction, and was always trying to get perceptively closer to it. As he wrote to his friend Alfred Stieglitz, "If we have not the boat, we miss something of the storms and weather that seem to give me more." Art historian Andy Pietro notes that how in his diaries he recorded the annual migration of birds, the planting of his vegetable garden, the appearance of the first leaf on the willows, and the springtime hatching of ducks and swans. Much has been written about Dove's interest in visual understandings drawn from patterns in biology and the idea of organic form, and critics have also placed him in a larger tradition of transcendentalist American artists, recognizing his Thoreauvian self-sufficiency and his Emersonian impulses for intimacy and immediacy with the natural world. In the 1920s, when moored in Huntington Harbor, Dove made 25 assemblages, what he called things, collage pieces that, in the words of art historian Rachel DeLue, serve to, quote, register and record diary-like Dove's habits of looking, finding, and gathering. The array of materials in the things were often pinned or glued down, similar to pieces on display at a natural history museum, but with a different intention in design. So the image that we have here, Long Island, I'm going to follow the title. I understand this work as a sort of visual metaphor for the island, or as an assemblage of what one sees, finds, and gathers here. To begin, we have the North Shore's dominant geologic material, its sand and stones of quartz and feldspar. We have its physical geography, the Harbor Hill moraine, that defines the hilly terrain of the North Shore. We have the Mytilus edulis, also known as the blue mussel or common mussel, and there's one oyster over there as well, which figures prominently as if to form the foundation of the place. And indeed, for thousands of years, shellfish long formed an economic foundation as a source of food and commerce. We also have twigs and leaves and a gesture toward the botanic world. And of course, as it's the 1920s, we have the Ford, not a part of natural history per se, but rather an engine that would work to both facilitate connection and impel environmental destruction for the 100 years to follow. So Dove eventually moved away from the assemblages, yet continued to explore landscape as a means of representing Long Island's natural environment, concerned with how it feels to be on, in, and part of that island. In another work, also entitled Long Island, which I'll show you in 1 minute, we see what I believe to be 2 glacial erratics. And this is just my photograph of these rocks that are residents of the North Shore. But here's Dove's painting. So I think of this painting in terms of what Ed Casey would call an earth map, in that it works to, quote, recreate a qualitative aspect of the earth and sometimes the entire aura of it in the painting. The painting recreates the qualitative aura of the erratics and the sense that they are ancient residents of the North Shore, part of its enduring spirit of the place. And so as a poet, in my ekphrastic process, I spend time with this painting, right? And then I find the corresponding place in the landscape, and I let kind of that alignment help me generate a poem. So I'm going to read you a poem. I'm going to share a poem with you that actually was just recently, we have like a poetry path in the village I live in. They kind of displayed these poems by the water. So Dove's Long Island, 1940. I too know these North Shore erratics, these rocks the size of elephants. Perhaps you too also learned about them in middle school geology, Pleistocene deposits dropped by a receding behemoth. Perhaps you also have walked the Comset bluffs, have gazed at Target Rock, are part of the North Shore's story, submerged in salty seas, a piece of sea glass smoothed by its tides. Arthur doves look like magical eggs, beauties basking in the glow of a late summer beach day. The shore is jagged, but the rocks are round. Like elephants, they never forget. Like Whitman, they know the earth remains broken only to those who remain broken. Like me, they don't stray anymore. Philosopher and painter Megan Craig writes that, quote, there are things one can only learn through a drawing or painting, a secret knowledge, like the intimacy acquired by handling the surface of a rock or shell carried for years inside a pocket. Painting is a way of touching things and being touched by them in return. Dove's Long Island represents one of the North Shore's most distinct geologic wonders in a way that touches me, that recalls to me my childhood days, admiring their glow and presence and sensuous being. They are like old friends, and each time I behold the painting, I feel myself coming home. In her seminal study of Dove, Deleuze argues that Dove's interest was in the encompassing natural system, and his turn to abstraction allowed him new ways of representing subjects relevant to natural history through a more systems-based view. In particular, Dove's theorization of color and line were connected to visually containing systems-based energies and exchange. And he closely studied objects in the natural world in order to develop both his craft and his contemplation. Consider the following famous expression of his condition of light theory from 1930 as articulated in a letter to Alfred Stieglitz. There was a long period of searching for something in color, which I then called a condition of light. It applied to all objects in nature, flowers, trees, peoples, apples, cows. These all have their certain condition of light, which establishes them to the eye, to each other, and to the understanding. To understand that clearly, go to nature or go to the Museum of Natural History and see the butterflies. Each has its own orange, blue, black, white, yellow, brown, green, and black, all carefully chosen to fit the character of the life going on in that individual entity. And while animals and insects and plants do appear in his work with differing degrees of representative likeness, his trips to the museum were ultimately about the possibilities of color and line. He was less interested in copies of natural beings, but rather in positioning the being as part of a natural system, drawing out the connections between parts, the networks, the rhythms, and patterns innate to organic forms. As Dove's son noted, his father's time at the museum had to do with his mixing and experimenting with pigments. Along with color, Dove paid close attention to the lines and shapes in nature. As he wrote in a statement for a gallery exhibit in 1927, the forest lines of a tree seemed to me to be more important than its monumental bulk. So there's an image here. This is a painting from 1928, seagull motif, violet and green. You know, we don't really see a more of like a mimetic seagull, but we have this idea of the motif recognizing a sense of musicality. Dove seems to be thinking about the rhythm of the seagull, the ways they move, the patterns of flight, the musicality in that flight. We also have the motion in the waves and in the winds. And I'm convinced that this painting was conceived looking at a particular spit of land on the tip of the neck, which would mean the view would be from the boat. So there's a lot of motion. And, you know, I could talk more, but I'm going to keep going. So to close, I would like to turn to another seagull painting from a few years earlier, which I think emphasizes these ideas even further. And I'll leave you with another poem. And this one's a prose poem, another ekphrastic prose poem, which recognizes Dove's play with the visible and the invisible, as well as the ways in which abstract landscape becomes a way of drawing us into place in a self-consciously phenomenological way. Or as Ed Casey writes, quote, "It is in and through landscape and its many forms that our relationship with place is articulated and represented. Certainly it is through Dove's landscape that my relationship to place has come alive." So Seagull Motive, Arthur Dove, 1925. "Through what you made on the harbor, I see things about our place that are both visible and invisible. And this coming from invisibility to visibility sifts out some of my anxious reaching to be somewhere else. how hard it is to see what is right in front of me, how easily one drowns in the drama of daily strife, those yellow-beaked squawkers always seeming to be stealing my bagel and pooping on my beach chair. The painting cares about how they move, how intent they are on moving and how they are part of the movement. The motif is the metaphor, the motive is the motion, the invisible made visible, the paint catching what it feels like to ride a current, gifting a glimpse of the glide, the emotion of motion, the wings and the waves and the waves and the wind. All morning, I gaze at the art book, and in the afternoon, I leave my tiny house and walk to the shore and position myself where sand meets sea meets sky, stretching my arms wide so the invisible takes shape in my cells. I find the palette's splash of purple an escape of steel blue sea and linen shaded sand. I become part gull, lines of white and gray and black undulating with the wind bands, first in the painting, then in the sky, then deep within, the invisible made visible, the beautiful moving through me, the immanence of landscape, this gift you offer, this traveling in place. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Jessie, for such an inspired and inspiring talk. And next up, our next speaker is Alison Carranza, Post-baccalaureate in Cultural Heritage Research and Practice at Yale University. So Alison, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. So in the interest of time, I'll just kind of get started. So having spent the majority of my undergraduate career at Vassar College working in the school's collection of pressed and dried plant specimens, I found myself interested in the intersection of art and science, most formally in the representation of botanical imagery on different forms of media, things like botanical illustrations and herbarium specimens. So before I really get into my research, I wanted to take a second to provide some background information so that you might have a better contextual understanding of the things I'll be talking about today. So an herbarium specimen, in its most simple definition, is a pressed and dried plant specimen. And so these are often pasted or taped, somehow mounted onto a piece of paper, and this helps to avoid deterioration and helps to preserve the specimens. These sheets often include annotations that state the nomenclature, locality, and collection information, which you can see here in the bottom right of each of these specimens. And perhaps most interestingly, these specimens can act as pockets of almost perfectly preserved information from the past. They encapsulate the thoughts of botanists up to hundreds of years earlier, preserve valuable genetic information, and maintain plants in the same form, shape, and relative color as the day the collector pressed them. Together, the specimens form a library of plants called an herbarium. So throughout my time in a seminar focused on early modern Italy at Vassar, I began to pose questions about herbaria and these representations of nature, but found that there were no answers to my questions in the literature. I wanted to look into why these herbaria were even created, especially if there was already access to botanical gardens and illustrations. And ultimately, I decided that I wanted to explore the rise of herbaria and also books of botanical illustrations, existing not only as a cabinet of curiosity of sorts, but also as a form of gardens themselves. So what I found allowed me to understand that herbaria were created as a form of garden to further the early modern understanding of plants, despite the presence of botanical illustrations, because they together were needed to create a picture of plants in their entirety. So while the exact history of herbaria remains somewhat a mystery, it seems as though the process of pressing and drying plants began sometime within the 1530s in an act of documentation and preservation. This was a time of colonialism and introduction of Europe to flora from all over the world. And this process likely began with Luca Ghini, who was a professor of botany in Bologna with his students. These early modern herbaria consisted of multiple sheets bound together in the format of a multi-volume book, mimicking the style of florilegia, which are bound books that contain botanical illustrations. While Ghini's herbaria have been lost to time, they were likely very similar to those created by Ulysses Aldrovandi, a student of Ghini's and whom he was eventually succeeded by at the University of Bologna. So Aldrovandi was a large proponent of natural history, and he began to focus on his herbarium in 1551, and by the time of his death, it consisted of 16 full-bound volumes of dried and pressed plants. But the use of botanical illustrations to further the study of plants was very controversial, especially because of ancient disputes about the role of art in science. Galen was really adamantly opposed to representations of plants in the form of art or literature because of potential misinterpretation, and Pliny looked down upon those who even tried to capture the essence of plants on paper. This controversy among respected ancient thinkers ultimately led to a lot of uncertainty about the inclusion of illustration in the study of botany. But eventually, during this early modern period, botanists decided that the use of illustrations should be encouraged when access to the physical plant itself would be limited, which ultimately pushed forward the development of botanical illustration. And so with this kind of decisive move, renowned botanists and upper-class patrons commissioned unique florilegia to explore the world of botany and further discussions of ancient literature. The illustrations within these books were both conditionally beautiful and scientifically accurate, which you can see here. This idealized Mandragora autumnalis illustration represents the artist's ability to capture and perfectly imitate each detail of the physical plant specimen on paper. It illustrates the multiple appearances of the plants, including the forms of both flowers and buds simultaneously, while also representing each wisp of a root as it branches off of the larger root body. But it was really rare for artists to be able to capture this level of scientific accuracy while simultaneously producing a very beautiful piece of artwork. And as a result, artists with this ability were very highly sought after, and they expected very large payments for each commissioned work. Then, with the widespread use of the printing press, illustration suddenly became cheaper and more widely available. But of course, with a decrease in cost came a decrease in quality. An increase in demand for books not only meant that there was not enough time to create intricate prints, but also that the same block print would often be used for multiple different plants. This meant that printers no longer had to seek out artists for each illustration, which lowered the cost for each book. But with so many repeated uses, these already rudimentary woodblocks would become worn, and with each use, their quality would decrease. And this reduction in quality was stark, as you can see in this illustration, which is meant to show the same Mandragora plant from the previous slide. The illustration, which lacks details and would be repeatedly reapplied for a variety of plants that only vaguely resemble one another, wouldn't have been very useful in the world of science or botany. So this created a space in which herbaria could be introduced to provide the information that the botanical illustrations lacked. This is one of Aldrovandi's herbarium specimens, which captures the reality of the Mandragora plant. The leaves provide insight into the larger size of the plant, and you can even see each individual vein traveling throughout the leaf. The flowers are also arranged so that the viewer can access both the side profile, which allows for viewing of the sepal at the base of the flower, but also the reproductive structures that fill the void at the convergence of the petals. This represents a stark difference to the idealized illustrations and also the rudimentary woodblocks that we saw on the previous slides. So when thinking about the herbarium and these books of botanical illustrations as gardens, I really began to ask myself, what are the key aspects of a garden? So in his essay, Landscape Metaphors and Metamorphoses of Time, Michel Conan emphasizes the importance of narrative while a visitor is within a garden, especially in early modern gardens. He emphasizes the significance of a visitor's initial entrance to a garden, citing Villa d'Este's design, that led visitors to create their own narratives as they moved through the garden. This potential to create a multitude of narratives through movement is one of the key identifiable components of a garden. Each visitor must experience the opportunity to form their own narratives based on a series of decisions as to which paths to take, its sites, and its overall experiences. And of course, with each visitor having different perspectives, backgrounds, and values, the creation of infinite narratives and memories becomes inevitable. Similarly, while experiencing an herbarium, there are a multitude of narratives that can be created by each visitor because the viewer often moves through it in search of resemblances between specimens, which can vary based on the intentions of person to person, as opposed to reading it from start to finish. The very idea of compiling specimens together into the form of a book strengthens the argument that, to the creators of these herbaria, these were narratives. For them, it was only natural and logical to compile natural historical knowledge into a humanist form. This is because treatises and manuscripts by ancient thinkers acted as examples of studies of natural history that early modern thinkers and botanists would naturally draw from in creating their own explorations of natural history. Narratives in the form of books acted as the humanist method of dispersal for information, And so creating a bound composition that documented findings, explorations, and revelations related to botany was a logical approach to disseminating this botanical knowledge. So in continuing to think about herbaria as gardens with narratives, we can also look at the method of organization for both botanical gardens and herbaria throughout early modern Italy. Aldrovandi's design for the first botanical garden in Bologna, seen on the left, shows this meticulous design and planning, with each section having been assigned a letter and each smaller area designated with a number. Not only was this method scientifically based in taxonomy, but it was also aesthetically organized, heavily based on form, color, and size to ensure that each bed was beautiful. With this in mind, it becomes clear that both forms of paper gardens, florilegia and herbaria, together made up the aesthetic and scientific aspects of botanical gardens. Because while it would have been rare for a botanist to organize their herbarium based on aesthetics, herbaria similarly use numbers to organize each specimen systematically. As you can see in a specimen from Aldrovandi's herbarium, there are two numbers on the top right. The 400 to the foremost right is likely the page number in the book, while the number next to it, 42, likely acted as a collection number assigned to both its notes during the time of collection and the specimen itself, so that his notes aligned with the specimen. This scientific-based organization prompts movement in a very systematic way, based largely on collection practices. Books of botanical illustrations, on the other hand, were often arranged purely on the basis of aesthetics. Here on the right, you can see the careful composition and placement of the plants on the page of Aldrovandi's illustration. In this example, his study seems more formal. You can see him concisely noting the name of each plant depicted in the illustration and nothing more. Meanwhile, Aldrovandi's herbarium specimen on the left illustrates the common practice of including notes related to possible classifications alongside the specimen. This acts as almost an informal stream of consciousness, moving away from formality and creating a stark difference between herbaria and the books of botanical illustrations. This shows that narrative in herbaria or florilegia can be reconstructed in entirely different ways due to their appeal to different audiences. This is because a florilegium is no longer in the form that would appeal primarily to botanists, but rather in one that values form, structure, and composition. In combination with one another, though, the movement through both an herbarium and a series of illustrations could provide a fuller narrative that more closely resembled that of moving through a botanical garden by encompassing both aesthetics and the scientific study of botany. Another key characteristic of gardens as a whole, but especially botanical gardens, is the ability to create a microcosm of the world within their walls. Early modern thinkers often made attempts to understand the surrounding world through the only way that was easily attainable during this early modern period. They created and studied microcosms of the world. So it was only natural for them to use the garden in such a way that allowed for wider studies. You can see this represented in the botanical garden at the University of Padua, which contains a circular garden surrounded by water meant to portray an idyllic world and its oceans, as well as plants cultivated from throughout the world. This approach allowed for early modern thinkers' expansion of their understanding of the world as a whole. As a form of garden, botanical illustrations were similarly able to act as a microcosm of the world, both in their attempt to convey knowledge of the plants' surrounding ecosystems, as well as their attempt to document the plants of the world as Europe expanded into these newer areas via colonization, something that was not always possible in herbaria. As this illustration shows, it was common to include various animals or insects that would often interact with the plants in botanical illustrations. And while there's no explicit reference to this within the description of this illustration itself, there's a very strong resemblance between the wings of the butterfly and the delicate flower petals of the plant. It may have been possible that they used these similarities in an attempt to better understand the plant through the butterfly or vice versa. So not only does this illustration provide insight into the plant itself, but it also highlights the relationship between the plant and its surrounding biotic ecosystem. This also speaks to the early modern practice of attempting to dominate the world around them in order to understand it. And while this isn't necessarily dominating it through cultivation, the act of containing the essence of a plant's being on a two-dimensional surface, either through an illustration or an herbarium specimen, can be considered a form of domination in order to further understand as well as encompass the world. So throughout this presentation, I've explored how both forms of paper gardens together created this picture of plants in their entirety. But there is definitely still room for future research about how these depictions were used together. Some historians have stated that botanists who could not draw created herbaria. which is logical, suggesting that usually botanists had one talent or the other, but it also excludes botanists similar to Aldrovandi, who created both beautiful botanical illustrations as well as mounted volumes of herbarium specimens. A botanist who was unable to create both could have commissioned various illustrations, but it would have been extortionate to create the illustrations to the level of detail and accuracy required for purposeful study to accompany their herbarium specimens. And so ultimately, early modern thinkers depended on both forms of paper gardens in order to create a more complete understanding of the plants they studied. The practice of collection, documentation, and identification through the creation of herbaria and florilegia has remained constant and persists to this day, although their primary uses have changed over time. With the development of genetics and genomics as a field of biological study, the art of herbarium creation has taken on new roles. Frequently, the relevance of the persistence of herbaria gets called into question nowadays with the rise in popularity and ease of access to photography, but herbaria have still not become obsolete despite the possibility for photographic preservation, because they also preserve valuable genetic information that can be used to track evolutionary changes over time, as well as have the potential to predict responses to future environmental changes, which is really important given the climate that we live in today. So ultimately, this means that the methods and uses of these paper gardens have evolved alongside the plants that they contain and represent. Their relevance remains constant in both the sciences and the arts, as they continue to be viewed as both items of beauty and items that contain an abundance of information about the past, present, and future. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Alison, and thank you for highlighting themes that will certainly be central in many discussions in this conference, the issues of representation, collecting, the relevance of collections, and of course, our themes are very special to the Academy itself, being a home to very important and large natural history collections, including vast herbarium. And one of our botanists, Dr. Chelsea Smith, will be with us in the collections viewing later today. So thank you, Alison. And now, last but not least, the last speaker in this session will be Marisa Karyl, Franz, Clinical Assistant Professor of Museum Studies at New York University, who will be speaking about specimens of nuclear nature, the aesthetics and imagination of irradiated life.
Thank you so much. I'd like to reiterate the land acknowledgement that Adriana Link began with, noting that both New York City, where I work and live, and Philadelphia are located on Lenape-Hoking, the ancestral lands of the Lenape people. And I want to recognize the continued significance of these lands to Lenape nations, past and present. I'd also like to emphasize, given my specific topic, that nuclear waste, nuclear storage, and nuclear pollution are disproportionately impacting indigenous lands and lives. Nuclear tests, nuclear bombs, and nuclear waste stay with us as the after products of nuclear fallout. As a second sort of preliminary note, I would also like to introduce a brief content warning that some of the images I'll be presenting include images of human remains, fetal and blood, and discussions of radiation sickness, death, as well as irradiated, dead, and mutated insects and plant life. Thank you. Okay, everyone else did it so smoothly, so one of us had to get it wrong. At the epicenter of the Chernobyl disaster site sits the elephant's foot, a mass of corium, slag, and metals from the core ceiling that melted into a lava-like flow downward from the number 4 reactor that was damaged and caused the meltdown of April 1986. The elephant foot remains radioactive to such an extent that after 30 seconds of exposure, you will experience dizziness and fatigue. After 2 minutes, you will start hemorrhaging. And after approximately 3.5 minutes, you will have been exposed to a lethal dose of radiation and have a life expectancy of 2 days. Nicknamed the elephant's foot by the initial crew, the mass has now been photographed, sampled, and fired at with AK-47s. This corium and slag mass has become an iconic image of nuclear meltdown, framed by the metaphoric naming of it as a natural history specimen, a disembodied elephant foot. Prior to it being sampled, its materiality determined, and the details of its creation established, it was aestheticized and personified as a dead fragment of a living being. While not a biological specimen, the elephant's foot entangles the animal body and the fragmented sampling in nuclear aesthetics. Radiation is invisible, It requires sensors to render it perceptible, such as the iconic beeping of a Geiger counter. To visualize radiation, we need a mediator. In this paper, I consider the usage of the body as mediator for visualizing radiation, specifically the specimen body, fragmented, dead, objectified, and preserved. The sampled specimen offers a view into irradiated life through the scientific narratives of objectivity and visibility that offer a permissibility to look, dissect, study, and document. At the same time, the intimacy of being, the possibility for recognition, renders legible the incomprehensibility of nuclear destruction that Derrida calls fabulously textual through and through. The impossibility of documenting total nuclear destruction, the totalized destruction of the archive in Derrida's framework, means that we can only narrate total fallout through representation. Textual here does not equate solely with written materials, but with a broad canon of human production, oral, visual, code, mathematic, etc. In the following 5 examples, I briefly introduce the fabulous textuality of the body and the narratives of science specimen culture, present as both an element of post-fallout nature, where mutated nuclear bodies are displayed for our viewing. The specimens reflect the 2 sides of nuclear technology, energy and military, that while distinctive are always already conjoined. The images of these non-human living beings, mushrooms, plants, insects, and flowers. These non-human beings offer a recognition of life while attempting to mitigate the mutuality of species recognition, a mutual self-awareness of the human as a Dasein or self-consciousness in the Hegelian sense. The language of scientific objectivity is again crucial here in distinguishing between the human, non-human as subject, object. Examples of human bodily specimens in artwork reflect a more intimately embodied radiation that personalizes and recognizes the fallout world we ourselves are located in now. In contrast, these non-human specimen bodies draw viewers into a post-anthropocentric textual imaginary of a post-fallout Edenic nature, healing and adapting in the aftermath of human destruction. This image is made from within the context of a larger art project by Sai Guo-Chung, titled The Century of Mushroom Clouds Project of the 20th Century, where he used gunpowder and cardboard tubing to recreate clouds from explosions at nuclear testing grounds, the Manhattan skyline, and land art sites associated with the work of Michael Heiser and Robert Smithson. The Lingzi mushroom rests on white paper, centered with the taxon name Ganodrama japonica embedded in a medical mixture, Ganodrama japonica Lloyd. It's dated and localized as dried in Manhattan in 1996. Echoing the aesthetics and data collection of herbaria samples, the artist also renders this piece a preservable specimen of his own more ephemeral art. More explicitly specimen art, Agnès Tonder's Chernobyl herbarium. The plants parts seen in these images are dried specimens from an herbarium run by Martin Hajduk at the Institute of Plant Genetics and Biotechnology within the Slovak Academy of Sciences. Hajduk himself has utilized these and other specimens in his research on plant development in irradiated soil near the meltdown site of inside the Chernobyl exclusion zone. Tonder's photogram process requires the specimens to be placed on light-sensitive paper and exposed to high levels of light to create a negative imprint of the plant. The original photograms are now stored in a basement in lead containers as they are themselves radioactive. Mirroring traditional herbaria specimen, Tonder includes the specimen name, location, and in this case, the amount of radiation exposure per hour. And that's the textual band at the bottom of each image. Appearing almost as light-emitting entities or as X-rays, photograms play with familiar representations of radiation as a glowing light or as penetrative of the external structures of the body, exposing its tissues, bones, and organs. But we're not seeing inside these plants. They're not glowing. Our visual associations are tricks of the light. What we are seeing is a corporeal map of the external structure of the specimens. Using specimens and imprints, Masao Okabe's floor-to-ceiling displays of frontages, which are rubbings, and pressed flowers document the landscape of Hiroshima's Ujima railway station. Specimens and illustrations come together as an atlas mapping out the site-specific microcosm of a fallout space created after the detonation of an atomic bomb in 1945. The artwork's titular quote, "Is there a future for our past?" looks generationally into the future from the perspective of those who face the violence of atomic warfare. The second part of the title, "The Dark Face of Light," recalls to us the shadows of Hiroshima, where the negative image of a man's body as it was vaporized remains on the steps of the bank after the detonation and the nuclear flash. Masao Okabe has subsequently produced a body in Fukushima, a performance art piece of a dancer performing inside the Fukushima exclusion zone on the 10th anniversary of the meltdown. Okabe's work reflects the unique history of Japan as the only nation to experience the full spectrum of nuclear disaster and nuclear reliance. Similarly, based on collected specimen are the watercolor illustrations of Heteroptera, or true bugs, from sites in proximity to nuclear installation and fallout. Cornelia Hesse-Honegger worked as a scientific illustrator for the Natural History Museum at the University of Zurich prior to starting her durational art project of painting specimens from her expansive personal collection of over 18,000 true bugs. Blending art and research, she has collected specimens from sites including areas surrounding active power plants in Germany and Switzerland, the meltdown sites of Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island, which are the ones shown here, testing grounds in Nevada and Utah, and atomic bomb factories near Hanford, Washington. Throughout these works, Hesse documents the mutations and deformations embodied by these insects. Her collections and illustrations seek to show that, quote, "Even the best maintained nuclear power plants are in fact extremely dangerous to nature and also to human beings." Finally, Megan Gafford's Pushing Daisies, the work combines sculptures of irradiated daisies set in resin inside bell jars and graphite drawings. Working with an unnamed physicist, Gafford exposed daisy seeds to radiation, mimicking the experience of flowers around the 2011 Fukushima meltdown. Unlike Hesse-Honegger's work, Gafford distances herself from framing her specimens as scientific evidence, writing, quote, "I'm not trying to solve the puzzle. I've never wanted my art to be propaganda for my position on, say, the safety of nuclear power or the wisdom of mutually assured destruction." Nevertheless, writing about the conclusion of her project, Gafford notes that it, quote, "taught her what it can about scientific amorality, the consuming passion where molding nature to her will feels exhilarating." These 5 works by these artists trace the impact of radiation and nuclear technology on nature from its everyday existence in operating nuclear power plants to its singular deployment in atomic warfare by the United States and Japan, its duration of atomic testing, and finally its fallout sites of 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima. In all of these works, the being presented is dead, and their deaths are presented as data specimens offered for examination. The aesthetics explicitly draw from scientific specimen display, the dried herbarium pages, the pinned insects, and the floating spirit collections we can see here. Daston and Galeson discuss in their work on the intellectual history of scientific images the moralistic erasure of subjectivity from selection and documentation of specimens. The concept of a holotype is that one singular specimen is named as the exemplar of a species, typically by the person who is credited with identifying the taxon. Daston and Galeson note, however, that, quote, "the typical is rarely, if ever, embodied in a single individual. Yet this desire for an idealized normative specimen has fueled scientific illustration innovation from the hand-printed atlases to the specimen to the photograph and beyond. These irradiated specimens reject this normative framework. They hint at mutation and deformation. The supposedly neutral and objective perspectives of the scientific specimen and illustration abut the viscerally charged response and embodiment of nuclear trauma, violence, and destruction. The abnormality becomes uncannily familiar in the representation of an elongated daisy head. The specimens belie a biological future rooted in the past of nuclear meltdown, detonation, and pollution. The romanticized reclamation of irradiated land by nature offers a tempered optimism of the mutant future in the afterwards of nuclear fallout in the Anthropocene. The larger landscape of nuclear aesthetics is without people. It is strange, it is uncanny, and it is beautiful. These specimens are the discoveries of explorers in this new land, a human scientific colonization of a post-human space. Human intrusions into this natural history are invasive in the utopic nature. Unlike the specimens of plant and animal life, artworks that contain human remains are affectively charged with subjecthood. The recognition of trauma enacted by radiation is unable to be objectified in its aesthetic form. Ukrainian New Wave artist Ilya Chichkin's The Sleeping Prince of Ukraine presents an abnormal fetal specimen that the artist borrowed, and it's somewhat ambiguous what this means, from a medical collection. He photographs them dressed in costume jewelry, seemingly asleep and serene. These fetuses are presented as fairy tale characters, not as specimens from the estimated 1 million abortions that occurred in the aftermath of the Chernobyl meltdown due to fears over birth defects from radiation. Strong reactions from this work when it was displayed at the Venice Biennale framed it as, quote, gratuitous and tasteless, and a depiction of a poor dead child exploited for media sensationalism. Chichkin, however, sought to draw attention to the public's voyeuristic carnival curiosity into the survivors of Chernobyl and expose the transgressive and visceral nature through the artwork to purposely reject the neutrality and permissibility that specimen presentations offer. Lastly, Taras Polotaikin, a Ukrainian-born artist now working in Canada, unveiled his work Cradle in 1995. Here, a metal tub is suspended by industrial chains within the gallery, filled with blood and sealed over with a metal top. The blood inside is the artist's own, drawn after intentional exposure to radiation in Chernobyl and collected over a 14-month period, then stored in a freezer to preserve it until the mounting of this exhibition. The blood accounts for, quote, the full equivalent of his bodily complement of slightly radioactive blood. Politaiko states that this work exposes radiation as a latent agent that is beyond narration or language. Quote, you can't see it, smell it, taste it, but when you become aware of its presence, you're not separated from it anymore. It's impossible to be an observer because you start to change. The ability to be an observer, a scientist exploring the post-fallout natural world to collect specimens, is impossible for Chichkin and Politaiko. The objective view is rendered null through the exposure of visceral sensationalism and the threat of contagion and bodily mutation. The works of these other artists I have discussed, who use the sort of natural history specimen, are themselves not neutral, but play with and reveal the fiction and frictions of scientific neutrality. The uncanny mutated specimens reject the desired normality of a type specimen. However, the lens of permissible looking at these specimen aesthetics offers a comfortable entry point for viewers, where the door is open and you're welcome to look and revel in the aesthetic beauty of the dead bodies of plants and insects. Only on closer inspection and contextual awareness do the mutations reveal themselves, the disturbed thorax and the asymmetrical yellow form on the insect's shield. The strange beauty of the Edenic post-fallout world, where mutated animals and plants take over the ruins of the Anthropocene, is disturbed by human presence. Seeing mutated fetuses and irradiated blood displaces the imaginary of the deep future of a natural renaissance, and instead reminds viewers that we live beside these disturbed forms and contain within ourselves traces of isotope Soratorium-19 that was released into the world with the detonation of nuclear bombs. Thank you.
What a way of concluding this round of presentations with a talk that raises fascinating questions about what is the meaning of specimens, types, classifying, and so forth. Wonderful. So now we will have our panel discussion. While you gather your thoughts, I'll kick it off, and I have a question for the group. Thank you all for your fascinating presentations. I would like to go back to the title, really, and what we found was kind of a common theme throughout the presentations is this idea of sensory experience. But there's more here than that. There's really sensory, emotional resonance, feelings, etc. That came across, for example, in Jesse's presentation, clearly, or resonance with the author, the place, etc. And for example, Alison, I appreciated how you guided us through your own process of thinking, how the questions kept on emerging as you start to find your way through herbarium. And then Julie told us about the emotions at play and the possible feelings of freedom and represent engagement with nature and with representing nature as being liberating. And Marisa presents this really strong, provoking material. So I'm curious, I would like to invite you to briefly reflect on how your very emotions and feelings about these subjects, these materials, these visual representations reflect on your work. In your case, Jesse, I think it's more evident. So I would tweak the question for you a little bit, which is, if you didn't have this strong resonance with the place and the author, would that be different? Please use the microphone and just, yeah.
Good?
Yes.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think that, you know, we can sort of take a specimen out of the place, but can we take place out of the specimen is a real question. And I do think that there's tremendous value in familiarizing ourselves with the specimens of our places, and that all art forms kind of mediate that and help us get closer and get in there. And I think there's a restorative and ethical value in that as well. And for me, you know, I think quite personally, like the pandemic prevented me from traveling. So I was very like challenged to have to shift my focus. And I've just found it so fascinatingly, like kind of bottomless, how much there is right in front of me. And yeah, so I don't know though, like if I would, I was thinking about this a lot. Like I also work with Georgia O'Keeffe, who was a good friend of Dove's, but she painted in the Adirondacks where I go every summer. So I'm really working now with artists and writers who I have that connection with, but I think it does help me in my own creative process.
Yeah. So would the other speakers like to share some thoughts about their own emotional resonance with these subjects and how this reflects or not in their work? Julie, maybe you would like to just next.
Yeah. Okay, still on. I mean, yeah. So you're interested in like our personal, like, sort of emotional responses to the work we're looking at.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, for me personally, there are a lot of resonances. You know, just because you know, what really started interesting me, I mean, I got interested in Tyley because, you know, these botanical illustrations, I actually just came across them by accident in an archive. I wasn't looking for them at all. I was doing research on breadfruit, which is, you know, much more well-known topic. So actually, yeah, the whole reason I started working on Tyley is that I requested some other materials, and then the archivist helping me at the Linnean Society of London was like, well, do you know about these illustrations? Should I bring them out? And I said, well, okay, sure. Yeah. And then I just opened the folder, and it was kind of like almost like being hit in the face. Like they were just like kind of glowing in the light. There was one I didn't dwell on. It was in one of the early slides with multiple images, but it was like a sort of pink flower with a lot of like twisty, lines in the blossom, and it was just kind of amazing, like glowing in the dim light of the archive. And I think because a lot of times when people write about 18th century botanical illustrators, I mean, just because of the limits of the archive, it's really hard to know anything more than just what is in the illustration itself. So I actually try to get a bit more into what Tyley was thinking and doing, and maybe even feeling when he was creating his art. I actually took some botanical illustration classes at the New York Botanical Garden because they have a certificate program that's quite rigorous. And so that actually was a really cool sensory experience where I got to feel the frustration and the joy of painting in watercolor.
Thank you, Julie. Alison, would you like to share some more thoughts on that with us?
I think I got it.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Okay, so when I was an undergraduate, I was mostly focusing on, like, my training was in biology, but also I was trying to wrap in this art history minor as well. And so I was kind of battling with the dichotomy between like being trained as a formal biologist, where you're kind of dealing with the physicality of the specimens, but you're not encouraged so much to focus on the context and the cultural, just the cultural existence of these specimens, versus kind of in my art history track, it was more like thinking entirely about these kind of cultural importances of the specimens and what they can mean to kind of broader theories and like these thoughts about existence and what it means to be art. And so I think this paper was really my attempt to kind of merge the two. I mean, I kind of mentioned at the beginning, this is kind of like born out of my thoughts about the intersection of art and science, where I was really trying to think about how these could be used both as items of beauty, but also things that contained an abundance of information. Especially because when I talk to people in either the arts realm or the sciences realm, the way they prioritize specimens can be very different, I actually curated an exhibit at my undergrad institution, kind of looking at like where these herbarium specimens lay on the spectrum of art and science. And a lot of the artists that I talked to would like really value aesthetics. And a lot of the scientists would say like, oh, this isn't a good specimen because look, you can only see one side of the leaf. And so this was kind of me trying to understand this, but also like contextualize it in the historical context of like where these things were actually born out of, especially given how many other botanical resources there were at the time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, this work is sort of born out of the two threads of my own sort of nebulous research. One of those is I'm interested in the ontology of things, what things are. And to me, irradiated things have a sort of unique ontology, a sort of dual ontology as the thing themselves and then the irradiatedness of them. That's a sort of imposition, almost like a parasite living on it. And then this work was really coming out of my own sort of curiosity about my own ethics of looking. Why do I want to look at these things? What is that sort of curiosity there? And how does that entangle us in a much larger question of ethics surrounding nuclear proliferation, atomic warfare, and the sort of hyper embedded and embodied experiences of radiation, this sort of invisible, smell-less, scentless sort of thing that nevertheless becomes a sort of inhabitants in your body.
Thank you. And we have a question from the floor. And I'll ask those of you who ask questions, please start by briefly introducing yourselves to the whole group.
Sure. My name is Michelle McDonald. I'm from the American Philosophical Society. And it's a question for Julie, but then it feels like it almost resonates in the same way that your question did, Pedro. So Julie, I was, great presentation. All of you, great presentations. I wanted to know a bit more if you could expand about John Tyley's, I love the efforts to try to consider his agency in creating these images. So to what extent did he have control over subject matter and dissemination? So you're focusing, and I think justifiably so, on the creative moment and what that means in terms of self-expression and a sense of personal freedom. But if you could look at the chapters before and after, that would be helpful too.
Yeah, thank you for your question, Michelle. It's a really good question. And, I do, I am interested in finding the moments where Tyley has a little bit more agency, I think. But it is worth thinking about the other phases of the whole process, not just the creation, but, like the initial design and planning, and then the dissemination, as you say. In terms of the planning, I think, Alexander Anderson, the botanist in charge who hired Tyley, definitely had more control because it was his catalog project initially. And, he was basically telling Tyley, for the most part, which plants to draw. I would say he was entirely telling him, but there are like a couple really interesting illustrations. For instance, there's one of an avocado, which, kind of breaks the pattern, because Anderson, just from what I've seen of his writings and the illustrations he had Tyley do, he really wanted to depict more of the super rare plants, the ones no one had seen before. And honestly, often some of these plants that he had Tyley depict, they weren't really like attractive plants aesthetically. Like they were just like little weeds, that nobody's noticed before in the Caribbean. So there's this beautiful avocado illustration. I've often wondered, did Tyley actually choose that one? Because he also signed that one. He didn't sign all of them, but that one's signed. It's really, really well done. There's also like sort of different levels of doneness, and that one was very, very finished. So I think, I think there's ways to find moments of agency. Dissemination, I don't know how much agency he had there because the book never got published. And, Anderson seems to have held on to the illustrations and then they went to the archives after his death. But that's an interesting question to think about. Think about it some more.
Thank you, Julie. I believe we have another question.
Hello, my name is Luis Seria. I'm from the University of Porto, and I want to congratulate the colleagues that presented for their inspiring talks. I want to make a small remark to Marisa, which I really enjoyed the presentation. And for me, someone that works with specimens, it's really interesting to see these disformed specimens, like, let's call it like that. But I also have a responsibility, and that's more a remark I wanted to have. So I'm a commissioner of the International Commission of Zoological Nomenclature. So for the people who don't know, it's basically the international body that regulates naming species, animal species, but also holotypes. Mm-hmm. And the holotype concept is a very difficult and complex concept. And the main problem on the concept is the name type. So a holotype doesn't represent a typological category. So a holotype doesn't represent the perfect specimen. It represents the specimen that carries the name of that species. So we can have a holotype of a specimen that was irradiated with the nuclear radiation. So it doesn't mean that that's the perfect specimen. It's something else. It can be, you can have as an holotype the largest specimen of that species or the smallest one. It's sometimes the one you have. So it's just that remark about it's not a typological concept.
Yeah, I think holotypes are such a curious category because they're very subjective. It's sort of why I chose them. And then you're right that I'm sort of not doing full justice to their category. And I sort of took the easy way out by throwing up a museum label to sort of offer further context in the sake of time. I think what I'm interested in holotypes for is their relationship to the discoverer, right? And we can sort of probe what does it mean to actually discover a species, discovery by whom, for whom. But that reminds us, I think there's an insistence there on that subjectivity of specimen collection that is sort of not always addressed as fully when we're talking about what is a specimen, how are they picked, that it's sort of inherently an authored piece. As opposed to just sort of a general type specimen. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have another question here and then another one here.
Great, thanks. Great presentations, everyone. I'm Roland Wall. I'm the Director of Environmental Research here at the Academy of Natural Sciences. So I actually just stepped across the street from the Society for Freshwater Sciences conference, which is going on at the same time. So a little bit of a split in my brain here at the moment. This has already been alluded to, but I certainly in hearing you all discuss the objects you were looking at, I heard taxonomy, I heard glaciation, I heard some molecular biology. To what extent, and obviously it was already mentioned, there's some have background training in this already. To what extent does the sort of scientific technical elements of the stuff you're looking at, understanding that, having a background in it, to what extent does it influence your work? To what extent could it hinder your work? Just a question.
Yeah. Would you like to?
Sure. I guess I'll answer this first with an anecdote that I had a moment entering this building and thinking about my topic that I felt like I should have sent it to my high school science teacher who almost failed me in biology and say, aha, look at me now. I'm not a scientist. I don't work on nuclear science at all. I'm in the process of perpetually trying to learn and understand radiation and sort of half-lives and things that I only sort of loosely remember from my childhood. So for me, I work through the interpretive space. I think that's where, for me, Derrida's work has been so influential to think about that in some ways, all nuclear topics have to be representational, that if everything is destroyed in a nuclear complete fallout, who's left to think about it, right? The insects are dead, we're dead, the archive is bombed. And so that space of sort of fabulous textuality brings me in from an outsider perspective to think about the sort of discourse of nuclear work, which art is part of. But I'm sure there's all sorts of things I'm misunderstanding about radiation and the processes of nuclear power.
So I think in all facets of my work, both art history and also biological, I'm always trying to think about the human role in everything. And so just kind of for context, like right now I use herbarium specimens in my research, my biological research. And I will use the specimens, I'll take a tiny, tiny bit of the specimens and I'll do stable isotope analyses on them. And essentially this lets me track pollution levels over time, like quantify them before they could be quantified with technology, essentially. And so that's kind of like one way in which like I'm tracking how humans are kind of changing the environment and how we can see this quantitatively in the specimens themselves. And then I'm trying to tie in here kind of like why the specimens were made in the first place. Like I mentioned, kind of understanding these kind of contextual, the contextual bases for the origins of a lot of these specimens. So I think a lot of my work is, even the scientific work is largely informed by this role of humans and how humans are kind of creating and also influencing the world that we live in.
That's a wonderful question. And I appreciate, you know, this kind of play in interdisciplinarity that sometimes we get so segregated, you know, like kind of compartmentalized into our discipline, but, you know, that's not really how life works. And, you know, I'm trained as a Thoreau scholar. You know, I wrote my dissertation on Thoreau, and I think he's just a wonderful example of a poet, a philosopher, a naturalist, somebody with just like a kind of endless questioning and learning and observation and interaction, and showing how we don't necessarily need to separate those fields. But yeah, I sometimes feel like I don't have the more rigorous training as a scientist, but I have that sense of wonder, you know, what Rachel Carson would talk about. Like it's, you know, amazingly in front of us all the time. And so, you know, pursuing that knowledge, even if it's not in one's own discipline, I think is worth the work.
I'll just very quickly say, yeah, I don't have any training as a botanist. And, you know, sometimes I definitely wish I did, because Anderson and Tyley, you know, described and drew all these plants and gave them names that, you know, never got used. Sometimes it's actually very, very difficult to tell what the plant actually is. On the other hand, I love your comment, and I think it's important to remember, at least in my period, the 18th century, you know, most people who are doing botany were, quote, amateurs. You know, neither Anderson nor Tyley had any formal training in botany. And, you know, I do think something more universal, like this wonder, was driving them, and we can access what they were doing by remembering that.
Thank you. We'll take one last quick question here, and I'll ask the speakers to respond succinctly.
My name is Silva Baker. Okay, my name is Silva Baker, former librarian here. You all gave wonderful talks. I really enjoyed. I noticed there was a concentration on botany in your selection of natural history, and I wonder if you could stretch your imaginations and perhaps see if ornithology or some of the other elements would give you these kinds of sensory experiences.
And so I think this is a wonderful suggestion. And by the way, this is the place for you. We have all of these stuff, amazing collections of all of those fields. So this brings us to the end of our first session. What a great start for our conference.